The lawyer stopped mid-sentence. The room tightened like a drum skin being pulled too thin. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning, a sound that had been background noise a second ago, but now felt like a roar. My stepbrother, Marcus, let his smirk falter just a fraction. He had been leaning back in his leather chair, looking like a king who had already been crowned. My stepmother, Beatrice, frozen with her fingers curled tightly around her crystal glass, didn't move a muscle. The lawyer, a man named Mr. Henderson who had served my father for decades, was staring at a single sheet of paper that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. His eyes widened, and he adjusted his glasses, his hands trembling slightly. He looked up, and for a heartbeat, his gaze locked onto mine. There was something in his expression, not pity, not boredom, but a flicker of pure, unadulterated shock. Why was the lawyer looking at me like I had already won a game I hadn't even been invited to play? I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, feeling the heavy weight of the silence. Every person in that mahogany-walled room seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the next word to drop like a guillotine. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat and continued reading the first version of the will. It was exactly what everyone expected. The massive estate, the primary residence, and the bulk of the liquid assets were divided between Beatrice and Marcus. My name came up near the end. I was to receive a hollow inheritance, a small trust fund, and the old cottage by the lake where I had spent my summers as a child. It was a drop in the bucket compared to the $75 million fortune my father had built. Polite claps broke out from the extended family members sitting in the back rows. There were forced, sympathetic smiles directed my way, the kind people give to a loser they don't want to be associated with. I felt a slow, steady heat crawl up my neck. I looked at the floor, pretending to be disappointed, though my heart was actually hammering against my ribs for a different reason. The wording of the document felt strange. It felt incomplete, like a story that ended right before the climax. I noticed Beatrice exhale a long, slow breath of relief, her posture relaxing back into the expensive chair. She thought the ordeal was over. She thought she had successfully erased me from my father's legacy with a few strokes of a pen. I took a deep breath and stood up, introducing myself to the room as Abigail. My voice was steady, even though my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. I wanted them to hear my name clearly. This wasn't just a simple will reading. I realized now it was a carefully choreographed performance designed to shame me publicly. Beatrice had invited the cousins, the business partners, and even the local press under the guise of transparency. She wanted the world to see that I was the forgotten daughter, the one who didn't fit into the new, shiny version of the family she had created. But as I stood there, I felt a strange sense of clarity. I wasn't just a victim in their play. I was a witness. And I wasn't supposed to survive this, at least not socially or financially. They expected me to tuck my tail and disappear into the shadows of that small lake cottage. They wanted me to be a ghost in my own life. But my father had always told me that the most important part of any deal is the fine print. I watched Mr. Henderson's eyes dart back to the document, and I knew the fine print was about to speak. Marcus leaned over toward me, his expensive cologne filling my personal space. He whispered something cutting, a jagged little comment about how I should start looking for a job at a diner since Daddy's handouts were officially over. He didn't even try to hide his contempt. He knew the microphones wouldn't pick it up, and he knew his mother wouldn't stop him. Beatrice sat there, regal and cold, staring straight ahead, as if I didn't exist. She never stopped him. She had spent the last 10 years encouraging his cruelty, treating it like a sign of strength and leadership. This behavior wasn't new, it was practiced. It was the daily rhythm of my life since the day she moved into our house. They had turned my father's home into a fortress where I was the only prisoner. I looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and didn't say a word. I didn't need to. His arrogance was a shield, but it was made of glass. He was so sure of his victory that he couldn't see the cracks forming under his feet. He thought he had won because he had the loudest voice in the room. He didn't realize that silence can be much heavier than noise. My mind drifted back to the shift. After my dad remarried Beatrice, everything changed slowly at first and then all at once. It started with the small things, family photos being moved to the hallway, then to the attic, then disappearing entirely. Invitations to holiday parties stopped including my name, or they would arrive a day late. Decisions about the family business happened in closed-door meetings while I was out running errands they had assigned to me. I was 22 when I realized I was being edged out of my own life. It was a cold, calculated erasure. Beatrice was a master of the accidental exclusion. She would forget to tell me about dinner reservations or misplace my mail from the university. At the time, I blamed myself for being sensitive. I thought maybe I was just struggling to adjust to a new family dynamic. I didn't realize it was a campaign. I was being treated like a tenant in my own home, someone who is tolerated but never truly welcome. By the time I realized the walls were closing in, the process was almost complete. I had become a stranger in the house where I grew up, watching them build a life on the foundation my mother had laid. Then came the concern talks. Beatrice had a way of speaking that made every insult sound like a compliment or a worry. She would sit me down in the sunroom, her voice soft and dripping with fake concern. "Abigail, dear, you just don't seem interested in the business," she would say, her eyes scanning my face for any sign of weakness. "Maybe you aren't built for the stress of the corporate world. It's okay to be a simple girl." She wasn't asking for my opinion. She was documenting my supposed failures. She was building a narrative for my father, whispering in his ear at night about how I was drifting or unfocused. Every time I tried to step up, she would find a way to make me look incompetent. She would give me the wrong files or tell me the wrong meeting times, and then sigh dramatically when I arrived late. "She's just like her mother," she would whisper to Dad, knowing that my mother's struggle with illness was a sore spot for him. She was painting a picture of a daughter who is too fragile to inherit a legacy. She wasn't trying to help me. She was trying to bury me under a mountain of fake sympathy. I confronted my father about it once. It was a rainy Tuesday, and I had cornered him in his study before Beatrice could intervene. I told him everything, the exclusions, the lies, the way Marcus treated me like a servant. He listened in total silence. He sat behind his massive desk, his face unreadable, his eyes fixed on a spot somewhere behind my shoulder. He said very little, only nodding occasionally. "I see, Abigail," he had muttered, his voice raspy and tired. "I'm aware of how things are moving." That was it. No defense, no anger, no promise to fix it. I left that room feeling colder than I ever had before. I felt a deep, hollow ache in my chest because I thought he had finally chosen them over me. I thought he had surrendered to Beatrice's influence because it was easier than fighting. I spent months mourning a father who is still alive, believing that he had looked at his only child and decided she wasn't worth the trouble. I didn't know then that his silence wasn't a sign of weakness. It was the silence of a man who was carefully watching a trap being set. He was observing his new family, and he didn't like what he saw. The last dinner we had together is burned into my memory. It was just a week before his heart failed. Marcus was in rare form, joking loudly about who is truly built for legacy and who is just dead weight. He didn't name me, but he didn't have to. He kept gesturing toward the company's new headquarters, talking as if it already belonged to him. Beatrice laughed at every joke, her eyes shining with pride for her son. Everyone at the table laughed along with them, the business associates, the neighbors, the hangers-on. I sat there picking at my salad, feeling like a ghost at a feast. I looked over at Dad, expecting him to join in or at least smile. Instead, he was just watching Marcus. That was the moment something shifted in his eyes. It wasn't anger, it was a cold, clinical realization. He looked at Beatrice and Marcus the way a scientist looks at a specimen under a microscope. He saw the greed, the lack of empathy, and the sheer arrogance they were displaying. He didn't say a word to stop them, but he put his fork down and stared at his plate for a long time. I realize now that was the night he contacted Mr. Henderson to make the final changes. Weeks later, my father passed away unexpectedly in his sleep. There was no closure, no final words of wisdom, and no answers to the questions that had been eating at me for years. There was just a massive, echoing vacuum that Beatrice and Marcus filled immediately. They didn't even wait for the body to be cold before they started moving. Within 48 hours, they had changed the locks on the main house and hired a new security team. They acted like they were the grieving widow and the loyal son, but their eyes were bright with excitement. They moved so fast it was dizzying. They organized a lavish funeral that felt more like a corporate branding event than a memorial. They made sure they were front and center in every photograph, while I was relegated to the third row of the chapel. They talked to the press about carrying on the vision and protecting the family name. They treated me like a distant relative who was lucky to be invited at all. I was paralyzed by grief, but they were energized by power. They had been waiting for this moment for a decade, and they weren't going to waste a single second of it. By the third week, I was almost completely locked out. My corporate email was deactivated under the excuse of a security audit. Accounts were changed, and passwords I had used for years no longer worked. Meetings were held in the dining room while I was told to stay in the guest wing so I wouldn't disturb the mourning process. Beatrice would see me in the hall and smile that thin, sharp smile. "You're always welcome here, Abigail," she would say, "but we really need to handle the heavy lifting right now. You just focus on your grief." They didn't remove me physically. That would have looked bad to the lawyers. Instead, they made me irrelevant. They stopped including me in any conversation that involved money or the future. I would walk into a room, and the talking would stop instantly. They were carving up the $75 million empire like a Thanksgiving turkey, and I wasn't even getting the scraps. I felt like I was disappearing, becoming a shadow that moved through the house without making a sound. They were so confident in their control that they didn't even bother to hide their hushed conversations anymore. They thought the game was already over, and they had won by a landslide. The invitation to the will reading arrived via a formal courier, even though I was living in the same house. Beatrice had decided to make it a public affair. She invited the extended family, the board of directors, and several high-profile associates. "Transparency is the only way to honor your father's memory," she told me with a straight face. She wanted everyone to see the legal transfer of power. She wanted a room full of witnesses to the moment I was officially sidelined. It felt more like a stage than a legal proceeding. She had hired caterers and set up a bar in the library. It was a celebration disguised as a legal necessity. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was making sure that once the will was read, there would be no room for me to contest it without looking like a bitter, ungrateful child in front of the entire community. She was using the audience as a weapon to ensure my silence. I spent the night before the reading in the small cottage by the lake, the only place I still felt safe. I didn't know what was in that document, but I knew Beatrice wouldn't have invited a crowd if she wasn't certain of the outcome. The day of the reading was overcast and gray. The mahogany walls of the library seemed to absorb all the light, making the room feel heavy and oppressive. There were too many witnesses, cousins I hadn't seen in years, lawyers in sharp suits, and neighbors whispering in the corners. Beatrice was dressed in pure white, looking like she was hosting something sacred rather than a funeral proceeding. It was a bold choice, a visual statement that she was the new light of the family. Marcus stood by her side, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my car. I realized then that they wanted an audience for my fall. They wanted to see the look on my face when I was told I had nothing. They wanted to hear the murmurs of the crowd as I was bypassed. I took a seat in the front row, feeling every eye in the room on the back of my head. I felt like a gladiator entering an arena where the lions had already been fed. Beatrice glanced at me and gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a greeting, it was a challenge. She was ready for her moment of triumph, and she wanted me to watch it from the best seat in the house. Mr. Henderson stood at the podium and began to read. His voice was clean and professional, devoid of emotion. He started with the minor bequests, donations to charities, small amounts to loyal staff. Then he got to the heart of it. He read the primary will, which laid out the distribution of the $75 million. It was clean. It was simple. It was final. According to the document, the vast majority of the real estate holdings, the investment portfolios, and the controlling shares of the company were to be split between Beatrice and Marcus. My name was mentioned only in relation to the small trust and the lake cottage. As he read, I could hear the satisfied rustle of silk and wool in the room. People were nodding, impressed by the fairness of providing for the widow and the son who had worked so hard for the company. It was exactly what Beatrice had promised them. It was a perfect, legal execution of her plan. I sat there, my chest tightening until I could barely breathe, but I didn't react. I didn't cry and I didn't storm out. I knew that reacting was exactly what they expected. They wanted a scene. They wanted me to prove I was unstable. So I stayed as still as a statue. When Mr. Henderson finished the primary section, people actually began to nod in approval. I heard someone behind me murmur that it seemed very fair given my lack of involvement. The room was filled with the sound of quiet conversations and the clinking of glasses. My stepmother's face was a mask of mournful dignity, but I could see the triumph burning in her eyes. My chest felt like it was being crushed by a physical weight, but I kept my face blank. I focused on a small knot in the wood of the podium, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a single tear. I knew the room was judging me, seeing me as the girl who had been rightfully passed over. The narrative Beatrice had spent years building was now cemented in the minds of everyone who mattered. I was the uninterested daughter, and she was the rightful successor. The air in the room felt thick with their smugness. It was a suffocating feeling, being surrounded by people who were celebrating my loss. But beneath the pain, a small part of me was watching the lawyer. He hadn't sat down yet. He was still holding a single, thin folder that hadn't been opened during the first reading. Beatrice lifted her champagne glass slightly toward me. It was a barely there gesture, a tiny flick of the wrist that was unmistakable to anyone looking. It was a quiet victory lap, a private cheers to my defeat. She didn't say a word, but her eyes said everything. She had won. She had the money, the house, the company, and the public's respect. She had successfully turned my father's legacy into her own personal kingdom. Marcus was already talking to one of the board members, his voice booming with a new, unearned authority. He was already acting like the CEO, discussing restructuring and new directions for the firm. They were so busy basking in the glow of their success that they didn't notice the lawyer's hands were shaking. They didn't notice that Mr. Henderson was looking at the back of the folder with a look of pure dread. They were too wrapped up in their own brilliance to see that the atmosphere in the room was about to change. I stared at Beatrice's glass, watching the bubbles rise to the surface. She was so sure of her position that she didn't realize she was standing on a trapdoor. And the lawyer was about to pull the lever. For a split second, I actually considered leaving. My hand tightened on the strap of my bag, and I felt the urge to just stand up and walk out of the room, out of the house, and out of their lives forever. I could disappear right now and avoid the rest of this humiliation. I could take my small trust and my cottage and try to build something of my own. The weight of their judgment felt like more than I could bear. But something stopped me. A memory of my father's face during that last dinner flashed through my mind. He hadn't looked like a man who was giving up. He had looked like a man who was making a final calculation. I remembered the way he had watched Marcus and Beatrice with that cold, observant gaze. If I left now, I would never know what that look meant. I would be letting them win without even seeing the end of the game. I forced myself to stay in the chair. I forced my breathing to slow down. I was the daughter of a man who never left a meeting before the final handshake, and I wasn't going to start now. I settled back into my seat, eyes fixed on Mr. Henderson as he slowly opened the final folder. The room was still buzzing with low conversation when Mr. Henderson flipped the page. Suddenly, his expression shifted. It was subtle, but it was real, a twitch of his jaw, a narrowing of his eyes.
He stopped.
He didn't just stop, he froze. The silence that followed was different from the silence at the beginning. This was a heavy, confused silence. He stared at the page for what felt like an eternity, his lips moving silently as if he were rereading the words to make sure they were real. He looked like he had just seen a ghost. This part wasn't rehearsed. This wasn't part of the transparency show Beatrice had organized. I saw Beatrice frown, her glass pausing halfway to her lips. Marcus stopped talking to the board member and turned his head toward the podium. The lawyer's face went from pale to a ghostly white. He looked up, scanned the room, and then his eyes landed on me again. There was a new light in them now, something that looked like a mixture of awe and terror. He took a shaky breath, his fingers gripping the edges of the paper so hard they turned white. The performance was over, and the reality was about to begin. However, Mr. Henderson began, his voice cracking slightly, pursuant to an addendum signed and notarized 48 hours before the decedent's passing. He paused, swallowing hard. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet. My stepbrother's smirk didn't just falter. It vanished. He frowned, leaning forward with a look of pure confusion. My stepmother's glass made a sharp clinking sound as she set it down on the side table. Addendum, she whispered, the words sounding like a hiss. She looked at Marcus, who looked back with wide, empty eyes. They hadn't known. They had thought the will they saw weeks ago was the final word. But my father had been busy in those last 48 hours. He had been working behind their backs, just as they had worked behind mine. I felt a surge of adrenaline that made my fingertips tingle. The room felt like it was tilting on its axis. The fair distribution they had just celebrated was suddenly in question. The air in the library became cold and sharp. Mr. Henderson adjusted his glasses one last time, his voice regaining some of its strength as he prepared to read the words that would dismantle everything Beatrice had built. The lawyer looked directly at me before continuing. It wasn't just a glance. It was a deliberate, steady look that pulled the attention of everyone in the room toward me. My pulse spiked, a rhythmic drumming in my ears that made it hard to hear anything else. Why me? Why was I the focal point of this new document? I could feel Beatrice's eyes boring into the side of my head, sharp and accusing, as if I had somehow cast a spell on the legal system. Marcus was vibrating with a nervous energy, his foot tapping rhythmically against the floor. The cousins and associates in the back leaned forward, their faces twisted with curiosity. The stage had shifted. I was no longer the extra in the scene, I was the lead. The lawyer's gaze was a silent warning that the next few minutes would change everything. I sat taller, my spine straight, refusing to look away. I didn't know what was coming, but I knew my father had placed me at the center of it for a reason. He had finally spoken, and his voice was coming through the mouth of a trembling lawyer. The tension in the room was so thick it was almost a physical presence, a heavy curtain waiting to be pulled back. No one spoke. Not a single person moved. The room felt suspended in time, a snapshot of a moment before a disaster. I could see a bead of sweat on Marcus's forehead, despite the cool air in the library. Beatrice's hand was hovering near her throat, her fingers twitching against her pearls. Something was about to change, and everyone in that room felt it in their bones. It was the feeling you get right before a lightning strike, a static charge that makes the hair on your arms stand up. The victory that had been so certain just moments ago was now a fragile, dying thing. I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was fighting alone. My father was there in the form of that paper, finally standing between me and the people who had tried to erase me. The room was a vacuum of sound, waiting for the impact of the next sentence. I looked at the lawyer, and for a split second, I saw a flash of something like respect in his eyes. He knew what this was going to do to them. He took a final, deep breath and began to read the revenge my father had spent his last days preparing. The lawyer's voice was now loud and clear, echoing off the mahogany walls. He explained that the $75 million trust was not a simple gift. It was conditional. My father had added a conduct and integrity clause that governed the entire inheritance. The trust was to be evaluated based on the behavior of the heirs in the 30 days following his death. Specifically, it monitored how they treated the core legacy of the family, which included the dignity of his only biological child. My father had suspected their true nature, and he had set a trap. He had hired a private security and legal audit firm to monitor the estate's activities after his passing. Every move they made, the financial shifts, the exclusion tactics, the internal communications had been legally recorded and evaluated. The trust has already been evaluating, Mr. Henderson said, his voice gaining a hard edge. My stepmother's composure didn't just crack, it shattered. She let out a small, strangled sound, her face turning a mottled red. This wasn't luck. This wasn't a mistake. It was a masterpiece of legal design. My father hadn't just left a will, He had left a mirror, and Beatrice and Marcus had spent the last month showing exactly who they were. "The audit has concluded," Mr. Henderson continued, his voice dropping into a solemn tone. He began to list the findings. He detailed the unauthorized locking of accounts, the exclusion of the biological heir from mandatory corporate briefings, and the private messages Marcus had sent regarding the disposal of my interests. He even mentioned the change of locks and the security team Beatrice had hired to keep me in the guest wing. Each point was backed by a date, a time, and a legal statute. My stepmother's face was now a mask of pure horror. She tried to speak, but only a dry rasp came out. Marcus stood up, shouting that this was insane and a setup, but the lawyer ignored him. He read through the evidence like a judge delivering a sentence. They had failed every single conduct requirement. They had proven, through their own greed and cruelty, that they were unfit to manage the legacy. Every calculated move they had made to isolate me was now being used as a reason to disqualify them. It was a total reversal of fortune. The very weapons they had used to hurt me were now the evidence that would strip them of everything. This wasn't just about money. It was about the cold, hard proof of their betrayal. The room exploded into chaos. Marcus began to argue loudly, his face purple with rage, denying every word the lawyer said. He tried to interrupt, screaming that the addendum must be a forgery. Beatrice joined in, her voice shrill and desperate, claiming she had only been protecting the estate. But each reaction they had, each outburst of anger and denial, seemed to trigger more clauses in the document. Mr. Henderson calmly pointed out that their current behavior was also being recorded as part of the final conduct report. Paragraph 12, subsection B, he noted, states that any attempt to intimidate legal counsel during the reading results in an immediate freeze of all personal allowances. As he spoke, digital accounts were literally freezing. Control was dissolving in real time. The room watched in stunned silence as the two winners were reduced to screaming, desperate shadows of themselves. The more they fought, the more they lost. The cousins and associates who had been nodding to them minutes ago now pulled away, their faces showing disgust. The power dynamic in the room had flipped so fast it was dizzying. They were no longer the rulers of the empire. They were the defendants in a trial they had already lost. Their greed had been their own undoing. The lawyer moved to the final section of the addendum. Ownership structures began to revert. The controlling shares of the company, the primary residence, and the $75 million trust were transferred, not to a group, not to a partnership, but to a single individual. Authority transferred not with a bang, but with a series of precise, legal, and irrevocable statements. All of it was now mine. My father had ensured that if they failed the test, I would become the sole executor of his entire legacy. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I didn't even smile. I sat there in the middle of the storm, watching the world I knew be rebuilt around me. I hadn't won by force, and I hadn't won by being cruel. I had won by standing still and letting them reveal their own hearts. The transfer was absolute. Beatrice and Marcus were left with nothing but the original, small trust fund they had tried to give me, and even though it was subject to a lease they would now have to pay to me if they wanted to stay in the guest wing. The room was silent now, the only sound being the heavy breathing of two people who had just realized they were powerless. I stood up slowly, the weight of the $75 million empire now resting on my shoulders. I didn't feel heavy, though. I felt light. I looked at Beatrice and Marcus one last time. They didn't just lose the money. They lost their credibility, their alliances, and their control over the narrative. All of it had vanished in a single room, in front of the very people they had tried to impress. They were exposed, and there was no hiding from the truth of what they had done. I didn't say a word to them. I didn't need to. The silence was my final victory. I turned and walked toward the door, the crowd parting for me like the Red Sea. I left the mahogany walls and the suffocating air of the library behind. I walked out into the cool, gray afternoon and took a deep breath of fresh air. I didn't need to take revenge. I didn't need to plot or scheme or lie. They revealed who they were through their own actions, and my father made sure that was the only thing that mattered. As I reached my car, I looked back at the house once. It was just a building now. The legacy was finally where it belonged. I had survived their performance, and now, for the first time in my life, I was finally free to start my own story.